Europe's vaccine madness puts off its citizens from getting vaccinated, even as it threatens to seize other people's vaccines. Joe Biden's puzzled as to why he has a border crisis, and the UK is gripped by a wave of angst over violence to women. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Now, I don't normally cover the same main story 2 weeks in a row, but there was really no choice this week, because Europe's vaccine madness got even worse, as more countries, including ones that are in serious trouble with a third wave of COVID-19, such as Italy, halted the use of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And at the same time as having hundreds of thousands of doses sitting in fridges, the EU President Ursula von der Leyen threatened again to take dramatic action to prevent and to seize exports of the vaccine to the UK and potentially any other country that's further ahead than the EU in vaccinating its citizens. The EU medicines regulator announced on Thursday what the medical establishment had been saying repeatedly for the last week, which is that the vaccine is safe. Italy and Spain were amongst the first to confirm that they would start vaccinating with it again, and others have followed. Although it's an open question as to how many of its citizens will now agree to be given the AstraZeneca vaccine, with the doubt and the worry that the member states' actions have created. In France, for instance, just 20% now say that they trust the AstraZeneca vaccine. To all appearances, it seems to have been a massive action of self-harm. A number of people have asked the same question. What the heck were they thinking when they did this? The decision to halt the use of the vaccine came from the German Health Ministry, which picked up on reports of cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. And its actions were then followed, some have said blindly, by other European leaders. The vast majority of medical experts in the field have professed bafflement at the move. And the maths for this isn't hard. The action was prompted by the fact that out of 1.6 million Germans who received the vaccine, 6 women and 1 man, went on to develop this condition, 3 of whom died from it. Now, even if there was incontrovertible evidence of cause and effect rather than, no evidence at all, halting vaccinations in a pandemic means that more deaths are going to result from your action than will have been saved with those numbers. They said that they were worried there was a connection because they said there were 7 when statistically for this condition there would be just for 1. But at that level of low numbers, it's highly likely to be statistical noise. 11 million have received the same jab in the UK, and there is no evidence of increases in this condition. According to the Ehrlich Institute, the German medical agency, they said that they were already monitoring the rate of those cases. And on Monday this week, they decided to act when 2 additional cases came up that took the numbers up to 7. Now, that is incredibly bad statistical practice, a standard error known as sampling to a foregone conclusion. The particle physicist Tommaso Dorigo explained it like this on the Science 2.0 website. If you watch a running estimate which is subjected to statistical fluctuations and you wait for long enough, you will eventually see it fluctuate in the direction you want to detect by the amount you consider significant. That is bad, and it invariably leads you to overestimate the effect you are trying to assess. So why did all this happen? I mean, if we're trying to understand it rather than just, choosing sides and calling people nasty names, it seems to be cascading consequences. The political mistakes with the vaccine contracts, the original contracts for vaccines that Europe created, that has led to a febrile, fast-moving environment where people are on edge. And you can certainly see some of the politicians under particular stress using the techniques of deflecting blame. Add that then to a single act of incompetence in misinterpreting the data, being far too ready to see significance, and then you get an initial political action by leaders worried about further being blamed for something going wrong. And then it cascades. The Italian Premier agreed that this was largely about the politics, feeling obliged to follow Germany's lead, not because those countries' expert agencies had independently analysed the figures and themselves recommended that action. And so you ended up with this extraordinary outcome. Europe in pain for lack of vaccines on the one hand, but millions of doses of vaccines sitting in fridges on the other. and actions being taken that significantly raise the fear of vaccination amongst the population. You have to describe the end result as incompetence, because at any point in the chain, the intervention of a genuinely competent leader could probably have halted the cascade. After a couple of days of that, the EU president lashed out and threatened to seize vaccines destined for other countries, clearly with the UK in mind. Now, we might think it odd that when you have a crisis of confidence in a vaccine, that's the moment you choose to make this kind of highly provocative action. But the clue is in the language that was used, because it wasn't about the terms of contracts. It's been well established now that the UK has a watertight contract with AstraZeneca and the EU negotiated a less advantageous one. Rather, it's now couched in the language of fairness. Ursula von der Leyen said that the EU should get its fair share, but that's not how this works. Fair shares is the language of a playground, not international contracts. Either you have a system of global trade where companies choose to site their factories where it makes sense to their networks, and then people from all over the world freely enter into contracts with them, or you have national businesses or government-owned businesses operating as agents of the state where they are located. We thought that we all agreed in the former, but the arguments being made seem to be based on the latter. Vaccine nationalism is its logical outcome. The fact that the arguments are being made in terms of our fair share, it's an argument aimed at the citizens of the countries, not at the lawyers. But this isn't just about a random piece of incompetence. It's a fundamental challenge to the nature of the EU as a governing bureaucracy. It's lashing out because the politicians concerned are extremely aware of the fragility of the notion of ever closer union that's at the heart of the project. The danger is that all this nonsense starts to infect wider populations. Reporting yesterday suggested that 10% of Brits are now cancelling vaccine appointments or not showing up as a result of concerns from the recent publicity on this. GPs have reported they're now spending a huge amount of time reassuring people who raise concerns with them. From a statistical and an epidemiological viewpoint, it is just bizarre. And as I predicted when it was first mooted, the EU action to prevent the export of vaccine to Australia was indeed noted elsewhere. India has now followed suit, diverting a shipment that was intended for the UK to use for its own population. Now, I know they've done that because they have some intensely difficult problems with the poorer communities. I think I excuse them that significantly more than I do the EU, but in the longer term, there will be consequences. India has been one of the key regions for drug production capacity by major pharmaceuticals. You don't, if you're India, want to drive that away because of how you behave in a short-term panic. This is the world we're creating right now, the post-COVID world. Now, in a minute, we'll look at some of the rest of the week's news. But first, sometime climate scientist, sometime climate change activist, Michael Mann has a new book out called The New Climate War. In it, he lays out what he sees of the forces of inaction on climate change, how they operate and what should be done to counter them. He takes fire at people on both sides of a divide if he thinks that their contribution isn't helpful. Namely, he presents a very us versus them version of what this discussion is all about. I've always tried for focus on research and to argue against an us versus them approach. So here's the question. Was I wrong about that? Can Michael Mann persuade me that this really is a point where you have to decide what side you're on and climb into the trenches? And what does the discussion say about the line between science and political activism, a line that he rather straddles? And ultimately, of course, what it means for policymakers to be, quotes, following the science. I was going to do a book review, but generally my book reviews are just a vehicle to discuss the issues in the book. So that's what I want to do. That video will be appearing on Monday next week at 7 p.m. Join me for that. When I look at that first item about the EU vaccine madness story, there are two themes that stand out. One is the unintended consequences that should have been entirely predictable, but apparently weren't to lead us too far in their own bubble. The other is how focusing on a phenomenon that is statistically very rare, becoming amplified when you focus attention on it beyond all proportion. And those are themes that recur in some of the other key news of the week. For instance, Joe Biden is facing a border crisis. According to the Customs and Border Protection in South Texas, the Donner Migrant Detention Center, which is designed to house 250 people, is currently housing 1,800 people, 729% of its capacity. The facility was reported to be holding 854 children on February the 21st, most of them unaccompanied. The number of such children has tripled in recent weeks, currently at 300% higher than previously known. Whatever's going on, the administration that will happily use the word crisis to describe climate change is curiously reluctant to concede that the word might apply to this massive influx of people crossing the southern border. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, who was also clear that this wasn't a crisis, emailed Department of Homeland Security staff urging them to volunteer to help come and deal with what he said was overwhelming numbers. And this is now one of those stupid stories, and unfortunately for some, tragedies, that gets created by ideology and then has to be denied because reality is inconvenient. Whether you think Trump's approach was right or not, sending a signal to poor communities across the border that if they come illegally, they will be welcomed and released into the US. You have to be fairly deep into an ideological fantasy land not to think that's going to encourage people to go for it in huge numbers. In the UK, we have a notorious stretch of treacherous water between us and the continent. We still have boatloads of people trying it every single day. Now, I don't understand. Maybe you can explain to me why it is that the Democrats have adopted this position of a free-for-all when it comes to immigration. I mean, I absolutely understand the logic that says you may choose to welcome a higher rate of immigration. I don't get the just turn up illegally and we'll transport you in and let you go free attitude, which now seems to be an article of faith in the party. In any case, if that's your position, you should own it, pretending that the upswell is somehow not the unintended consequence of your position and that masses of unaccompanied children turning up can never, under any circumstances, be referred to as a crisis. Well, that is just political lying, except, without the tweets in all caps. Mayorkas did the predictable thing and blamed it on Trump. Trump did some dumb things and created some unintended consequences, but these are Biden's unintended consequences. A genuine break from the past would be for the party to own the result of the messages that you send out and to deal with them. The EU sent messages out about how unreliable the vaccine was. Oops, consequences. Well, that's Britain's fault. The Democrats sent messages out about open arms, welcome to illegal immigration. Oops, consequences. Well, that's Trump's fault. What about that other theme, focusing on a thing that's statistically rare but is made important by the focus applied to it? Well, in the UK this week, there has been a massive focus on the safety of women. It was prompted by the tragic and terrible murder of a woman called Sarah Everard. And she seemed like a lovely young woman who was reportedly a joy to know. Her life was cut short by a disgusting, horrible human being who also happened to be a serving police officer. And it was that fact that first made the story stand out and get the headlines. And then once it attracted the headlines, then very quickly the killing was quickly sort of co-opted as the basis for a wider campaign. As for George Floyd, so for Sarah Everard. But this time the focus of attack was simply men. And it became about every single act of sexual harassment to the level of so-called microaggressions. All was tied up to this new Me Too moment. Statistically, the circumstances of Sarah's death, tragic and horrible as it was, are extremely unusual. Statistically, men are far more likely the victims of violence than women. In 2019-2020, 506 men and 188 women were the victims of homicide. Over the past 10 years, the number of male victims has grown, the number of female victims has fallen. And statistically, there are few countries in the world where women are safer than the UK. Now, of course, any number over zero is not to be tolerated. But just as a matter of perspective, if we're talking about the lessons to come from what happened to Sarah Everard, those are things that are relevant. We've seen a number of horrible tragedies that have rightly appalled all right-thinking people without them nevertheless turning it into a mass crusade. They make the news because they are rare. In countries where they're common, they attract much less attention, or at least up to a point. People will reach the end of their tolerance at some point. There'll be a tipping point. Suddenly, however, everyone has been talking about the need to keep women safe from men. There's been talk that plainclothes police will patrol bars to try to spot any drunken blokes who are getting out of order with the women. The First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, implied that he would consider a curfew on men to keep women safe, and then, of course, had to quickly row that back when, amazingly, startlingly, something of a backlash emerged. But the big item was that a vigil for Sarah was organised against police instructions because of a pandemic. And although it started peacefully late in the evening, it began to get crowded and more confrontational and louder. And the police broke it up. A photograph of them arresting a woman who was on the ground was on many of the front pages the next day. Here it was, mostly, but not exclusively, male police officers manhandling women who were there to protest the brutality of men. There were quickly calls for the London police chief to resign. That was Cressida Dick, a woman. She refused to resign. And, you have to wonder whether the outcome of that would have been different if it had been a man. And the Home Secretary stood behind the police. That was Priti Patel, a woman. Again, fortuitous coincidence. In reality, of course, it really makes no difference. Police officers have fairly complained that they can never win. They get accused of being woke and too lenient on some occasions, after they've been dancing with Extinction Rebellion people, for instance, and then oppressors and the arm of a police state the rest of the time. There is a serious issue behind all of this in terms of the number of women who attest to having been assaulted at some point in their life and those that attest to medium or high level harassment as a more or less daily feature. That's absolutely a discussion to be had, particularly in how boys are educated, about the influence of online porn and how that's shaping the attitudes of boys, particularly in some communities. But like the COVID side effects discussion, the worst way to have it is to inflate in people's minds the most exceptional of circumstances and put terror into them whenever they step outside. You're more likely to die in a car crash, way more likely. But we don't spend all our time putting terror into the hearts of every passenger that their driver might be the one to make a mistake. The inability of the public, and politicians by the way, to form realistic assessments of risk based on statistical probability is a real shortcoming we've seen time and time again over the last couple of years. None of that is to minimise some of the very real issues that need to be dealt with. Now, in a minute we'll get on to replying to comments and the final thought for the week. But first, I think it's time for another Q&A video. I've already had some great questions from Patreon supporters, which will all be covered, but I should be able to cover a few more as well. So if you have one that you'd like me to answer, just post a comment below this video with the word question at the start. Questions, not essays, is the way to get selected. I mean, I try to read whatever you put, but essays won't work for a Q&A video. That won't be a live stream this time. I will do some more live streams, but doing it this way enables me to take questions from those who, for time zone or other reasons, can't join at a specific time. Interesting questions, hopefully get interesting answers. And then join me for the result going live on this channel at Wednesday next week at 7 p.m. See you there. The video about is China serious about climate change got a range of comments, including a number of the ones that I predicted were basically just anti-China. Here's a few excerpts. I am genuinely shocked at your total naivety. By the way, I've noticed that whenever somebody accuses me of naivety in the comments, so far anyway, they've always gone on to ignore any supporting facts and data in the video and to put forward a view based entirely on their gut feel or anecdotal evidence that is supposed to be self-evidently true. And so it is here. Have you done business in China? Have you worked with the Chinese with your own money / capital at risk? Clearly the answer is no. You make the classic schoolboy error of thinking that the Chinese think, act and react like we do. I have breaking news for you, Mr. Baker. They don't. It suits your narrative to believe / hope that the Chinese have seen the light on AGW. Well, no, I didn't say that. Oh wait, hang on, there's another one. Mallen, not everybody shares your religious dogma on climate. China is concentrating on clean air, not CO2. That's why it's replacing old coal-fired power stations with new ones. China is using the Paris Agreement to destroy its enemies in the West. You can bet that China will rip up the Paris Agreement when it's due to reduce its emissions, and no one will hold them to account. Before I even viewed your video, I knew you would go soft on China. I went neither hard nor soft on China. The point of the video was to look at what's happening, not to judge them one way or the other. I looked at what they said about their 5-year plan and the data behind the historical record of them delivering against targets in previous 5-year plans. I noted that they placed high strategic import in dominating the clean technology demanded by a world that's moving towards zero carbon, which is all documented in what they've said and in what they are doing. And I pointed out the history of China, where they've had a number of dynasties fall as a result of past climate change, which may challenge the cynics as to whether they would take such a thing seriously. It doesn't mean they won't pursue their geopolitical goals, which I also said. So look, if you're incapable of putting aside your own position and preferences to try to openly view the world as it is, not the way you'd like it to be, then you're always going to be surprised about what happens in history. Now, my assessment may well be wrong, but it's a conclusion based from looking at the evidence, so you need to engage with the evidence and why it's deficient if you're going to start throwing around the naive label. Philip Tetlock's group of super forecasters adopted a number of principles that enabled them in practice to consistently, hugely outperform anyone else in predicting certain future-focused questions. Taking a non-ideological approach, following the evidence, was at the heart of it. There was a quote in Tetlock's book where one of his best forecasters did badly on one question. I think it was on whether the Japanese Prime Minister would visit the controversial Yasukuni shrine. Reflecting after his prediction failed on that one, he acknowledged that he drifted away from what he normally did, which would be to research and to try to understand how the Prime Minister thought, based on everything that was written about him and what was known about him. Instead, he was thinking, would he visit the shrine if he were the Prime Minister? That's when you make the mistake of assuming that people think like you. So you think climate change is nonsense, so you assume China must do so as well? Then you're probably making the same mistake. If you were to come to that conclusion, it should be because you studied the evidence that led you openly to that conclusion. All right, I had a couple of other comments on a different theme on that video. I see you've started dating a hairstylist, and like the sharp new hairstyle, by the way. Okay, full disclosure. I forgot to rinse the conditioner out of my hair that morning. So back to normal today. So much for my future as a fashion guru. In the Times of London this week, they carried a couple of features on climate change in the run-up to the COP26 summit. It included an opinion poll to sound out the population and their perceptions. How much confidence does the public have that we can meet the net zero carbon by 2050 target? I don't know if they had an option, for how the heck would I know? I suspect if they had, it would have been the runaway winner. Instead, you got 32% saying that they did have confidence, 68% saying that they didn't. Climate policies they said that they would support the most included taxing frequent flyers and banning the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. Those had more support than opposition by some way, although it does depend on which way the don't knows jump. Least support came for taxes on meat, banning the installation of gas boilers in homes, building more nuclear reactors, and taxing gas to encourage people to switch. All of those measures are in consideration by the government, of course, and the point is they have no guarantee of support. Policies of that sort have to be well sold, they have to be competently implemented, neither of which you might say plays to the government's strengths on recent evidence. I think they're highly likely to mess it up in some areas at least. Why? Because all the opposition parties in the UK would simply have them go further and faster. Because the media will generally avoid sceptical voices that would attack and challenge the policy approach. In all areas, we do better if we get challenged. if we get pushed and scrutinised. Whenever I've come to a conclusion on a specific issue on this channel, I actively seek out the best arguments that challenge those conclusions. Government without opposition is way more likely to make mistakes. And I'm intrigued to know how this plays out across Europe. The European Union has committed to radical climate action, and it's demonstrated in recent weeks how easily it can lose the support of its population with its mixed messaging on vaccines. Whatever does or doesn't happen in this area, you'd have to think it's going to be a long, slower road with a lot more bumps in it than people are expecting. You can definitely move a society's energy base to clean energy. Can you do so with incompetent governments in charge? Well, buckle up. I think we're going to find out. Now, there are many things I don't understand. One of them is definitely the YouTube algorithm. After 3 months of strong growth and healthy views, over the last couple of weeks, this channel has seen traffic being somewhat throttled. Suddenly, upper 3-figure views per hour plummeted to low 2 figures. 5 or 6 videos that had all been performing strongly, all of them suddenly nosedived at the same time, like synchronous swimming. I know some people will jump to the conclusion that it's political, and I don't have any evidence to support that. I start on the assumption that I've got to up my game and put in the work, and that's the part that I can control. But once again, it's times like this that the good people who support this channel on Patreon make such an enormous difference. It means that I can focus on doing the videos that I want to do, even if that might be leading to shadow banning, which is possible, even if it's not my assumption. It means that I can tackle the most important questions as well as the popular ones, and ultimately that's what I want to do here. You can grow a channel faster by being in the trenches, fighting for your side, being an outrage merchant. Less easy if you insist on aiming for fact-focused, independent and non-ideological content, which is what I aim to do. If you would like to add your support, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated, right now more than ever. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.